Hey, folks. I think we'll get started. Thanks so much for coming. We have this nice, cozy space and just enough people and a few seats if others come in. So if people start coming in, we'll try to just shepherd them over here and hopefully it won't be too disruptive. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming. I'm really excited to introduce Jane Adams, our visiting artist at the Global Lab. We actually have a couple people now, which is perfect, so we can just get them set up here.
I can put my stuff someplace else to free up a seat.
Maybe that's a good idea.
Just stick it under the table here.
There's a few seats over here. Feel free to make yourselves comfortable. Cool. Okay, great. Awesome. Thanks for coming, y'all. We've been able to invite Jane, I'll introduce her in a second, with some funding from the Women's Impact Network for this Visiting Artist series that we've had. That's about intersectional AI, the ethics of emerging technologies. So we're really fortunate to have that funding and to be able to invite Jane. So Jane Adams is an artist working with emergent forms of mixed media, including data and generated content. She is also a PhD candidate in computer science at Northeastern University in Boston. Prior to going to Northeastern, she was at the Computational Stories Lab at the University of Vermont. She's also been working with industry. She's currently working as an engineer of machine learning-driven research software for biological scientists at Jackson Laboratory up in Bar Harbor, Maine. And this summer, she's been awarded a fellowship in AI and machine learning at Flagship Pioneering in Boston. So she's kind of mixing this world of working with industry, doing data visualizations, and still being an artist and offering a lot of really interesting thoughts for us to engage with today. So really happy to have you, Jane, and take it away.
Cool. Thanks so much. So what I wanted to talk about today is sort of a precursor to a workshop that I'm going to be running later today at 4 o'clock on the second floor of the Innovation Lab. So I hope that if you guys are still on campus, you could join us for that. And so I'll be talking a little bit about kind of the design choices that I made and thinking about how to make this a participatory design thinking exercise, and then also kind of go over some of the landscape of how we talk about AI art ethics. So there are a couple different perspectives, right, in the world that people have about AI in general. So one perspective is that AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, is going to gain sentience, rise up, and kill us all, right? And then there's another perspective, which is that AI is the future, and it's going to cure all of the world's wicked problems. No one will have to work anymore. We'll all live forever. We know that, we're a lot further away from AGI than the general public might think. And that it's a little bit kind of magical thinking, whether it's this eschatological apocalypse-driven thinking or this techno-utopian perspective. And I really like this quote by Frank Zappa, which is that it isn't necessary to imagine the world ending in fire or ice. The two other possibilities might be paperwork and nostalgia. And so this is kind of I think about this quote in the context of what's happening in the middle of this spectrum, because you have sort of the doomsday, you have the utopia, but then there are a lot of folks that are kind of in the middle with this perspective that it's complicated, right? There are some really great things that it can do for us, but there are also some really problematic things that it can do, including amplifying existing problems in our society. Some quotes that I have here, rather than being distracted by evil killer robots, the challenge to labor caused by these machines is a conversation that academia and industry and government should be having. And some great AI researchers, Timnit Gebru, Emily Bender, Angelina McMillan-Major, and Margaret Mitchell, wrote in sort of a rebuke to the AI pause letter that was, from this dystopian perspective, to say that the hypothetical risks of the focus on a dangerous ideology called long-termism ignores the actual harms that result from the deployment of AI systems today, which are a lot more grounded in reality and a lot more grounded in how we as humans treat each other. And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming into this exercise with. But specifically honed in on AI and creativity, AI and art. So one thing that's hard when talking about this is like everyone wants to talk about every single application of AI, and so I'm hoping that like in our discussions we can sort of focus really just on the creative industry part of that conversation. So when I was thinking about, how would I run a workshop and how do we decide what's ethical, I'm not an ethicist, and so I'm not really sure. Like, I think that a community-driven approach is sort of the best way to think about these things. And what I have here is a picture from the Moral Machine project, which was a project out of MIT in 2020 that basically was an extension of the trolley problem. And it asked people for these different computer vision systems, self-driving cars, in a situation where you have a pedestrian versus a person in a vehicle, if you are forced to decide whether the self-driving car hits the person on the street or in the vehicle, what's your preference? And then they did this for so many different permutations, right? Young versus old, 3 people versus 2 people, but one is the don't do anything track, and one is the intervene track. And so they sort of crowdsourced all of these different decisions of how people would like these systems to respond, and they thought that they might get sort of a global consensus. And what they actually found was that there were significant geographical differences in the priorities that people had. And so I think that this is a really interesting sort of seed from which we could draw an allegorical exercise in thinking about AI art ethics, is that we could take a cultural relativist approach or a social contract theory approach, which basically says that, like, can we think about ethics from a consensus perspective and acknowledge that there might be regional differences or social group differences about how we think about these things. And so really what I'm here to do today is really just to provide sort of that foundation and that design language to talk about these issues. But I don't think I'm going to have an answer for you on like how we solve these tricky problems. I think that we're just kind of at the beginning as a society of thinking about the language that we use and in the tricky situations. But I wanted to talk about a couple of those tricky situations. And I think that a design language is great because it allows this participatory process. So this was an artwork by Candy Chang that I really love called Before I Die, where she painted these walls with chalk paint and then invited people to come and with different colored chalk write down like what their sort of bucket list items were. And she installed this in various locations around the world. So they're in all different languages, and it's just a really interesting kind of community artwork. And so I took some inspiration from that when designing this as well. So I was thinking about what are the elements of a design language for the creative economy? And a lot of my work deals with network graphs. And it's a really interesting perspective where we can take complex ideas and simplify them down into entities and relations. And I intentionally when I was thinking about these different entities, I realized that particularly the artist and the artworks is sort of a muddy definition, right? There are situations where people might want to differentiate between digital versus analog art. Some people might define people who are using AI art generators not as artists. And so there's a little bit of wiggle room in this design language that I'm hoping will allow us to kind of express how we're feeling about these different categories. So I started building out these networks. This is one that doesn't involve any AI, but just from a thumbs up, thumbs down, how do we feel about this scenario? Starts with the artist over here painting a painting. The painting is exhibited by a museum. The museum goer is looking at the painting. They're paying the museum. And the museum, in turn, is paying the artist. Good, Dad? Yeah. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with this network? Yes?
I'm an artist, and I'm rarely been paid by the museum.
Right. Yeah, so it's maybe a hope, some wishful thinking, because it's actually more like this, where potentially a museum goer pays a museum, although I know that that's also something that doesn't always happen. The museum gives exposure to the painter and goes on painting. So it's interesting to think about these creativity ethics from the perspective of maybe our current systems are also a little bit flawed or could use some improvement. And if there's one thing that you take away from today, I want to think about the idea that exploitation is not a result of new technologies, it's a result of societal norms, right? This guy is saying, you know, great, my rent is actually 800 exposures. Like, you can't eat views on Instagram, right? And in academic publishing, we have a similar thing, right? Where the publishers are saying, can you review this for us? And they're like, are you gonna pay me? And you know, you wouldn't believe how many people also don't know that authors are not paid by publishers when they publish their scientific research. And so this has been a really common trope in thinking about or talking about AI art. There's this great cartoon by Tom Humberstone called I'm a Luddite and So Can You, where he talks about the idea of, like, you know, the Luddites were not afraid of the mechanized looms that were coming to replace them. They were afraid of not being able to feed their families. And so it wasn't about, you know, fighting technology, it was about fighting for workers' rights. I'm also reminded of the feminist Silvia Federici in 1975 wrote Wages Against Housework, which was her proposal that women should be paid for the housework that they're doing. And she says that, you know, to demand wages for housework does not mean that if we are paid, we will continue to do that work. It actually is to say, if we demand wages for housework, we can also then come from a position of power to say, I don't want to do that housework in exchange for not being paid. When I was adding this quote in, I actually found that someone had written a book, Wages Against Artwork, basically about the idea of, like, decommodifying the labor and of socially engaged art. So the idea that you know, people talk about making art like, oh, it's a passion, it's a calling on the sort of high end, and then on the low end, like, oh, it's a hobby, it's a, you know, it's just something cute that you do in your spare time. And both ends of that spectrum are a form of decommodification of labor. There's also this quote from Cory Doctorow, who, pluralistic, he's written a lot about emergent technology. And one thing that he brings up is the idea that giving a creator more copyright is like giving a bullied school kid extra lunch money. So it doesn't matter how much lunch money you give that kid, the bullies will take it all and the kid will still go hungry. So some of the loudest calls for exclusive rights over ML training are coming not from workers, but from media and tech companies. And so I like this cartoon here, right? The artist says, like, pay for artist training data, and the you know, OpenAI CEO or whoever says, okay, and then they hand the money off to Disney, and the artist is still uncompensated. So a lot of these tricky issues are not going to be solved just through copyright. There are some non-AI scenarios that have pretty well-established laws in place. So this is one scenario that we might be familiar with, where a collage artist is creating a collage. It's also satirizing some photographs because they dislike the content of the photographs. And so that brings us to the ideas of copyright and fair use. So, like, as a refresher, how does copyright actually work again? There's kind of this spectrum, right, from copyright being all rights reserved, Creative Commons being some rights reserved, and then public domain being no rights reserved. And then even within Creative Commons, there's like this, you know, logo explosion of all of these different types of licenses that you can have related to attribution, related to derivative works, related to share alike. So the idea that if you create a work that whoever creates a derivative work has to include the same license, and then non-commercial. So some people will distribute their work, you know, for free to anyone as long as whoever uses it isn't profiting from it. And so when we think about copyrights and the use of copyrighted works, you know, copyrights are the ability to copy, to distribute, to make derivative works. Use of copyrighted works might be reading a book or seeing a movie, watching the Red Sox at Fenway, borrowing a book from a library. And then in the middle here is fair use. So, you know, commentary, parody, and limited educational use. And so there are a lot of factors that kind of determine what is fair use: the nature, the substance of the use, the nature of the work, and then the effect on the value of the original work. So criticism and parody tend to be fair use. Situations like this kind of explain the idea of, like, what is the nature of the derivative work on the value of the original, where, you know, if both of these people are trying to sell a product that the derivative work can become competitive with that product and take away proceeds from the original artist. And it's a misconception, actually, that fair use can be determined by a checklist. It's kind of a muddy reality where it comes down to a judge, and it comes down to the purpose, the nature, the amount of the impact. So it's a complicated definition. And one of the questions is like, so why can't we just apply the laws that we have, even if they're a little bit muddy in their definitions? Why can't we just, take the copyright laws that we have and apply them to AI art? So there, is this interesting Venn diagram, right, of the creative work that needs to be protected versus the laws that we have to currently protect the work. And over here in the unprotected realm, these are all AI generated. So up here you have, in the style of, which for living artists can be kind of frustrating, right? If you have an AI art generator that can create something in your style, but currently isn't legally protected. And then also things like the use of likeness. There is increasing state level legislation to protect a person's likeness, but it's really not something that we have federally or internationally legislated against, and so that can be a little bit tricky. But then on the other side of this Venn diagram, you have patent trolling and slap suits. So this is X Corporation, Elon Musk's corporation, versus the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which was basically a lawsuit to try to silence them for their criticism of the platform and its promotion of hate speech. And a judge ruled in favor of the Center for Countering Digital Hate and said at the bottom here, this case is about punishing the defendants for their speech, is at the end of the day what the purpose was. And so when we think about this Venn diagram, we need to cover more of this area that's currently not protecting creative work that we feel might need to be protected. But we also don't want to create more of this area where we have more patent trolling and slap suits and things like that. So in some places, it's obvious that changing a single edge in the network is what can flip it from okay to bad, right? This is a very simple example where you have a musician recording a song, a person is listening to it and paying the musician. When we get into the world of torrenting and there's no compensation for the musician, it starts to be a sad scenario. But there are some situations where it can be a little bit tricky because two identical graphs could be okay or not okay depending on the story, right? Here we have a photographer who's taking a photograph of a painting and viewers are viewing that photograph. There's no compensation shown in this network here, but we could think about whether viewers are compensating that photographer and then using those images in a book or a creative work or on a product versus maybe this is just a documentary photographer who is going to a museum and taking pictures of the paintings in the museum to share awareness about the work. So it can be an interesting way to think about these relations. And then I imagine during this workshop that we're going to find that this very simple design language that I've created doesn't quite meet all of our needs for representing additional characteristics on edges and nodes to capture some nuance. So, characteristics on nodes might be tons of legal power or financial stability or membership of a majority group. Whereas, also economic situation could be, being broke and an unknown artist could influence the dynamics of the network. And then also, this question of when you have these kind of adverse scenarios and lots of legal power and a lot of conversation, it starts to become muddy, right? Which direction even do these edges go in? And whole court cases have been fought about that kind of thing. So are there any useful analogies for thinking about AI and art? One of my favorite is the Catalog of AI Art Analogies by Aaron Hertzman. So a very common one, right, is theft. So thinking about the idea that, if you take somebody's work and you use it for your own purposes without their consent, then that's stealing. it's a useful analogy when we think about loss of compensation, but it's also kind of falls flat in some scenarios, right? Because when these AI companies are scraping images, the original image still exists, right? It's not like if someone comes into your house and takes your television and you have no television anymore. Another useful analogy is photography. So when photography first came on the scene, there was a lot of pushback against it to say, this isn't art and it's taking away labor from artists. And we know with hindsight that painters still exist even though photography exists. Parrots is the sort of analogy. You might have heard of the paper about stochastic parrots. So the idea that these models are just kind of regurgitating what they've heard or seen. Collage, so similar to the idea of either remix or collage, that these generative models are taking little bits of lots of different things and chopping them up and putting them together. This one has been used like in favor of AI art and against AI art, because for some folks, they're like, well, collage is very clearly fair use. For other folks, they say, well, it's replicating individual pieces of artworks. Music recording is an interesting one. I hadn't heard of this story before, but apparently in the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of musicians were very upset about the idea of music recording. They felt that music should always be played in person, and that it was almost like capturing and jailing the soul of a musician to record the music. And we know now, right, that people still go to concerts and listen to music and benefit from the distribution of their music. Lava Lamp is another one that just says basically that like AI art is interesting to look at, but it's not art. It's just kind of like it's like a lava lamp. It's like mildly entertaining, but not anything that's kind of profound in terms of its creativity. Blurry JPEG is just the idea that it's taking what it's seen and reproducing a shittier quality version of the exact same thing. Conceptual art, so folks with this perspective kind of say that like, well, anything is art, right? And so of course AI art is art, because like anything that you do, any mark that you make could be considered art. Humans learning to paint, this was a really common one to say like, well, when humans learn how to encode things visually, they walk through museums and they observe paintings, and then they create their own work on paper with those images in their mind, and that a machine learning model is doing the exact same thing, where it's exposed to lots of different artworks, and then sort of creating something new from that exposure. Which has, some interesting, right, like humans and AI aren't the same thing. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then appropriation. So this, metaphor, thinking about the idea, I use a Romani person here who the Romani have had their culture used as Halloween costumes for a long time now. But the idea that AI art models are appropriating a creative culture. So all of these are great analogies, and I think that it's not that there's one particular one that's like the most useful for this conversation, but actually that we can kind of find an amalgamation of them and think about the drawbacks and the affordances of using these different analogies. So I encourage you to check out sort of more details about those in Aaron Hertzman's catalog of AI art analogies. Make sure you get a picture. So going back to our fair use definition, the purpose and the market effects can play a big role. As I mentioned before, the idea that an artwork might be taking away some financial benefit from a company. This is my own personal piece of theft that I called biophilia hypothesis. So I spent like hours and hours of painstaking labor scraping pages and pages and pages from Amazon, because I didn't know this, but Amazon sells potted plants. And so that's a great repository for images of potted plants. And then I trained a StyleGAN model and then created this latent walk video that is like an interpolation through the space of the representation of potted plants that the model has learned over time. And personally, I didn't feel too many qualms about this, because I don't feel that my video is taking away from the proceeds of Amazon selling these potted plants on the internet. Feel free to critique me on that. And similarly here, this is on the left, archived map from the European Digital Archive of Soil Maps, which shows really interesting work on like the geological distribution of minerals and the age of the earth and things like that. And then on the right, this was an excerpt from a music video that I created that is sort of this, undulating texture that's derived from these maps. And again, these are public domain images, but also it's a completely different purpose, right, from the original image. This one was interesting. So this was a StyleGAN 2 model that I trained on a subset of Studio Ghibli film stills. Some of you might have your ears be perking up because you've heard some things about Studio Ghibli and AI art in the news recently. Now, all of these images here are completely different from a Studio Ghibli film, right? These are made with StyleGAN 2, which was a model that came out in, I think, 2019. And so they're kind of like visual nonsense, abstract, but maybe inspired by the palette of a Ghibli film. And I didn't feel too conflicted about this because I didn't feel like I was trying to create something that would take away from the creative pursuits of this animation film that I love dearly. But in 2025, fast forward, these models have gotten so good, right, that this is a Studio Ghibli-inspired selfie by Sam Altman, and he's using the kind of brand and the name of Studio Ghibli to promote the use of his AI models, which are subscription-based, right, and so you're paying for them. And so this then, I think, becomes like an interesting territory where, like, does the quality of the AI matter in the representation? Or, things have been changing so quickly that, thinking about these models, it really matters kind of where they've come from and how they evolve over time. So with AI added to the equation, things can get really complicated really fast. Apologies for this mess, but here you can see you've got an artist that's drawing and painting. They're posting both of them on Instagram. We might even have problems with the data being derived from these Instagram users as a separate problem outside of the creative economy. Then you have an AI model that's being built by a model builder. Here, I used Orange for the model builder and for Instagram as sort of a catch-all for curator that could be publisher, that could be a person that's scraping images, basically anyone that's not producing an artwork themselves but is collecting artworks. And then training an AI model. And then over here, you even got more artists, right? Digital artists who some folks would say aren't artists at all because prompting an AI model isn't a form of art. But what they are doing is they're producing digital illustrations. Potentially, we could think about them also as curators because they're sort of subsampling from the infinite space of an AI model and then choosing which ones to present to the public. So, we might disagree on how to encode entities or relations. I think that's, an interesting part of this work. And we also may need to find creative ways of representing fractional entities. So when we think about AI, it's not just that a whole work is taken by itself and put into a model. You actually have tons and tons of little pieces of artworks in this embedding space being used by a model builder to train a model and generate a digital image. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with actually the mechanics of like how does AI actually generate images and text and video. So this is a GAN, which is a generative adversarial network. And the key parts to notice here are the generator and the discriminator. And while it's sometimes dangerous, I think, to anthropomorphize AI, in this instance, I do think it's useful to think about these almost as like a creator and a judge. So the discriminator is judging the works of the generator, and the generator is trying to fool the discriminator into thinking that something is real. How the discriminator knows what's real is because it also has a set of real data. So that's the training data that is collected. And so the discriminator is just given images after images, and it either says that's fake or that's real. And every time that it gets an answer wrong, the discriminator loses a point, and the generator gains a point. So the two of these networks go together back and forth like this for a really long time. So the generator is being rewarded every time that it's successfully fooled the discriminator. Meanwhile, the discriminator is being rewarded every time that it has successfully determined the difference between real and fake. And at a certain point, we get these diminishing returns, and we shut off the conversation between the two. And then that's where we get to the point of inference, where you're actually generating an image. So it's important to note that these are two separate steps. This whole situation here is the training step. And every time that you're using something like ChatGPT or DALL-E or Gemini, you're at the inference step. So it's a model that's already been trained. So anything that you are giving to the model, anything that you're sharing with that model, is not actually going into the model. It's not directly affecting the training data. Now, these companies will oftentimes take that information and then use it in subsequent training, but there's not a real-time feedback loop, and that's an important thing to remember. So why am I not worried about AGI, artificial general intelligence? Well, for all of the talk of one model to rule them all, most state-of-the-art models are actually a mixture of experts. So they actually are a bunch of tiny models underneath, and there are conversations happening between those models sometimes, or sometimes like all of the information is just dispatched to this one expert in biology or in humanities or whatever it might be. So that's kind of one of the reasons that I'm not super freaked out about an all-knowing God AI. Another thing to note about the training process and when we think about like creativity and AI art ethics is, I talked before about scraping, specifically scraping Amazon, which also owns tons and tons of data centers. It has a lot of resources for delivering content, delivering images to consumers. That's not the case for a lot of small-time artists. So a lot of small-time artists, if they're hosting their work on their own website, you really run the risk of what's called a DDoS attack. So this is a direct denial of service attack. It's what hackers do when they want to take down a website just by force. So they just throw tons and tons and tons of bots at a website, and eventually it becomes overwhelmed, and it's not able to serve data to real users. But you can inadvertently DDoS somebody without intending to if you're doing scraping where you don't have any kind of pause in between each time that you request an image. And so we're seeing even the Wikimedia Foundation, Wikipedia has seen web crawling double just in the last year, which then also increases their costs in terms of load balancing and server costs. Also, the carbon impacts of training and generation are non-negligible. The way that we quantify this is very much an open area of research. These two articles are a little bit old, from 2019 and 2023, but from the MIT Technology Review, that training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetimes. So these are those huge, billions of parameter models that are being trained by these major companies. And then the inference step that I was talking about before, every time that you're actually interacting with an API endpoint, this is saying that making an image with generative AI can use as much energy as charging your phone. But also, they may deserve some context. So this was a paper in Nature just last year that looks at the carbon footprint of text writing and image creation by AI entities and by humans. And so they are looking at things in terms of an individual human over the course of one day. What is their carbon footprint? How long does it take them to write text on a laptop or a desktop computer? And then how does that compare to one of these models? And so a lot of their argument here is that, well, it's a lot faster to generate a piece of text than it is to actually write a piece of text, just because it takes a lot of time. And we have to feed ourselves while we're doing that, and we're shipping groceries around the whole world. But what's an interesting critique of this paper, right, is the idea that if it takes me 10 seconds to generate one page instead of an hour, does that mean that I spend the rest of the hour playing outside, or does that mean that I spend the rest of the hour generating 90 more pages? Major tech companies also have an incentive to develop more energy efficient models. So it's not like they're running around with cash in hand being like, yes, we've destroyed the planet, let's keep going, right? They're also hemorrhaging money. So Google is saying that it costs 10 times more than a standard keyword search to ask something of Google Gemini. Apple has been sort of at the forefront of this process of releasing OpenELM, which is a small open source AI model designed to run on device. So there's a huge incentive for these companies to also think about the efficiency of their models. And also from a security perspective, a lot of consumers now don't want their data going out to a server farm somewhere. They would much rather that all of the inference be able to happen on device. Another question is, do models memorize their training data? For a long time, the idea here was no, and this was a big push against the idea that people had that AI art was just collage because it was using pieces of art. People said, no, because there's this embedding process that happens in the training step that it's not able to actually reproduce any of the images that are in its training data. This work, in part by a friend of mine, Matthew Gillespie, is about extracting training data from large language models and extracting training data from diffusion models, which are image generators. So at the top part here, it's hard to tell what's bolded here, but two of the things that they've bolded in their list here are named individuals and contact information. So they ran their own large-scale computation on these models. I think this was GPT-2. To figure out if they could actually extract information about real named individuals and contact information from these models. And they did find that while it was rare, it did happen. And then also here with the extracting training data from diffusion models, the idea that you wouldn't be able to extract an image from training data was derived from a premise that the images only exist once in the training data. And what we know from internet research is that that's far from true, right? The same image is uploaded to the web hundreds and maybe even thousands of times. And so especially for pictures of celebrities, for pictures from movies, logos, things like that, these might show up in the data quite a bit. And these are actually generated images that they were able to get these diffusion models to produce through some clever prompting. I keep going back to this subreddit post, which is the shower thought that people will swim in the ocean even if there are definitely many corpses in it. However, people will not swim in a pool with a corpse in it. Humans all have a corpse-to-water ratio that is acceptable for them to swim in. I think about this, right, because it goes back also to the idea in the I think it was in the 1970s, there was this common refrain that the solution to pollution is dilution, that if you have enough space, that it doesn't matter if you've polluted because it's such a small amount that it's negligible. And so this is one of the arguments that people have about the training data in these models, is that if an individual artist takes their work out of the model, the distribution of the weights is not measurably different. But then the question becomes, well, how much of that artist's work needs to be in the training data before it does become a measurable difference? And so I posit that to you as the corpse-to-water ratio of training data. Another question is, can AI own the rights to its outputs? So this image was submitted by a person named Stephen Thaler, a recent entrance to Paradise. But he wanted to say that that the author of the work was the creativity machine. So he had built what he calls the creativity machine. The model generates this image, and he wants to copyright this work as having been created by the creativity machine. The US Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia had a unanimous ruling on this, which said that it doesn't prohibit copyrighting work that was made by or with the assistance of AI, but it requires that the author of that work must be a human being. So it kind of puts some onus and responsibility on the human for the things that we're generating. So very sorry to Ada, the art robot, for not being able to claim authorship on her works. Aaron Hertzman, who I mentioned before with his AI art analogies catalog, is just a great person to read in terms of thinking about the language that we use to describe AI art. And one phrase that I love of his is visual indeterminacy. So it's like the weird and delightful artifacts of early AI art. This was a picture from Reddit in 2019 that says, name one thing in this picture. as you can see, it's a little bit of a difficult task, and yet it contains the same like energy as like an early 2000s digital, flash photography picture of like, I don't know, maybe a kid's bedroom or something. And then on the left here is Neural Zoo by Sofia Crespo. So she was an incredible pioneer in looking at taking like public domain images of flora and fauna and then collaging them in really like weird and interesting ways. And her work actually was what inspired me to train that Studio Ghibli model, right? I was interested in like what happens if you sort of smush together and transform and coalesce all of these different sort of energies from these creative works into something new. So I really like that term. And this is something that was characteristic of a lot of AI art that came out in like the 2019 to 2020 range. So this was before like DALL-E really became common. This was before Midjourney. Really the way that you created AI art was through StyleGAN. Here, this is an AI-generated painting by Robbie Barat in 2018. So Robbie collected all of these images of oil paintings and then trained a StyleGAN model and put a lot of work into sort of the tweaking and the code in order to get everything to actually work, because this was really cutting-edge technology at the time. The Obvious Collective then found Robbie's GitHub repository. There's actually some comments in the history of the GitHub repository where they're asking for support and like added features, uncompensated from the designer of this model, Robbie Barat, right? Which is something that's really common, like the free and open source software movement, is that people will ask for uncompensated labor and sort of expect that these open source software developers are, at their beck and call. So Obvious Collective uses Robbie Barat's model to generate this portrait of Edmund de Bellamy, and it sells at Sotheby's for, I think it was $345,000. And so this brings up like an interesting other bit of AI art ethics, right? Because model builders, whether you think about them as curators or creatives or thieves, still can be stolen from themselves. So when we think about a model builder training a model and then releasing it to the public, you can put a copyright thing on anything, right? Whether it's enforceable or not is another question. But if they release it CC by NC, they're explicitly telling anyone that encounters their code, hey, this is a non-commercial work. You can use it as much as you want, but you have to, the BY is by, so give attribution, and NC is non-commercial. So if somebody else copies that model, maybe changes it a little bit, releases it, and then starts selling a subscription to it, you have a lot of money moving this way, and a lot of non-commercials sitting right here. So maybe a little bit more context for that, the idea of what is transfer learning. Some of you may have seen this model before. It's called This Person Does Not Exist, also known as FFHQ because it's from the Flickr repository of face images. And it's commonly used actually by scammers oftentimes to create profile pictures. But I was really interested in the idea of like, what if I just, so you can take a model and you can train it again. So this is what I was talking about before, right? If you have this point of inference and you're giving feedback to a model and a company wants to then retrain their model, they don't have to start from scratch. They don't have to burn the amount of carbon of 5 cars every time that they train a model if they are sort of pulling that model in a new direction, but they're kind of coming from this base of using existing weights. And so this is what a lot of the StyleGAN work that I was doing came from, right? I would find a giant model that had already been trained and sort of pull it in one direction. And so this was, I scraped myself and my personal images. And it's a little bit nightmarish, but, but I created an FFHQ model that would only generate images of my own face. And so this is just, my GAN self-portrait, but an idea of how that would work, where, it didn't take very long to generate this video because I was taking the model weights from an existing model that sort of already knew what faces looked like. You can see that there's some like weirdness in the sides, though. So this brings up an interesting point about intellectual property is like, are model weights intellectual property? So OpenAI was in the news a little while back because it said that it had evidence that China's DeepSeek model had used OpenAI's model to train, so that it had actually been generating training data from OpenAI. And so the term that they use for this is distillation, so using the outputs of one model to train another on a massive scale. And a lot of people had some schadenfreude here of like, well, you stole art from people and now, you're getting your model weights stolen too, and it's karmic justice. But it raises interesting points about intellectual property and about ownership and how do we quantify these things and talk about them. So another thing that I think is interesting to consider is like, what is synthetic actually? So my partner, Michael, who will be at the workshop later tonight, is working on synthetic media detection. And I'm always bothering him with these questions that are like deeply philosophical of like, well, at what point is something synthetic media? Because actually, I would posit that a lot of the AI art that we're seeing is not on the furthest end of the spectrum. So the furthest end of the spectrum, I would say, is generative art, where you are literally just giving like numbers and math equations to a computer and having it generate visual media from it. GAN art, I would say, is a little bit more towards the human end of the spectrum, just because a lot of the training data is human-created artwork. Further along, you have deep fakes, right? So that's the idea that you might have filmed a video that's a real video of real people, but then you've done some transformation using AI in order to change what the content is. In-painting is something that a lot of artists, even those who are very staunchly anti-AI, might not even realize is AI, but this is a feature that exists in Midjourney. It exists in Photoshop. A lot of cell phones have it now too, where you can circle something and have the people in the background of your photo go away or whatever it might be. And that's using AI too. That's an inference step. Then continuing along this human-created spectrum here, we have analog generative art. So Saul LeWitt at Mass MoCA, if you haven't seen that permanent installation, it's a really good one. Basically, his artwork is creating these sets of instructions for how to create an artwork, and then the people at the museum are executing those instructions. So it's very similar to what the generative art Mandelbrot set is doing on the far left, except that it's all analog. And then at the very far end of the spectrum is handmade art. It's acting in a play. It's singing out loud. All of that fun stuff that we usually think of with art. So the reason I bring this up is that it's kind of a false dichotomy to frame this as like an AI versus artist debate, because a lot of artists are actually using generative methods and using AI in their processes. These are two more examples that I really enjoy. So on the left here, these are vases created by Alex Costantino. He's an artist in Burlington, Vermont. And he was a very early adopter. I think he might have been in the DALL-E artist early access program. So he's generated this image with AI, and then he's using them to carve his own vases and ceramics. And then this story, I'm going to share these slides. I don't know if we can get them distributed, but the links to all of these are embedded, so you can actually go and read these stories. This was an interesting one where on the left side, this is a GAN breeder image by a woman named Danielle Baskin. GAN breeder was a very early website for playing with GAN art, where people could take images and sort of merge them together, and almost like the video game Spore, where you're like creating these lineages and speciations. People would make these creative works that were, had some really beautiful visual indeterminacy. Then came along this artist, Alexander Reben, and he was using GAN breeder and took some images from GAN breeder and commissioned an artist to paint them. And then, this is actually a photograph of a canvas hanging on a wall. Well, the people from GAN breeder were irate because, they said that, I've taken hours and hours of time in order to breed these images into the, image that I wanted. And, what he did is he just went to this website and he took them and he painted them and said it's a new artwork. So that was an interesting debate. And he actually had no idea that that's how people felt about it. He didn't know how long it took to generate them. And he was extremely apologetic when he found out. He was like, oh, I had no idea. I thought that it was just you press a button and it spits out art. So another question is, does it matter if the impetus to use AI comes from within or on high? This one is somewhat ethics, but it's also somewhat just like emotion. I wasn't really sure where to put this into the slides, but you may have heard this before, that an AI won't replace you, but a person who knows how to use AI will. Someone's CEO probably. And these quotes were from an article that just came out recently that's talking about what it's like working for a company that's forcing AI on its developers, specifically in the games industry. And these were 2 pull quotes that I pulled. The first one from a consultant and an artist in the games industry that basically says that the whole process of creation is where the ideas come from. A lot of video games are not fully ideated before the creative process starts. The video game comes from the act of creation. And then similarly here, this was a senior game designer who was instructed by a supervisor to generate text using AI. And he said that it created something that was just marketing speak. There were buzzwords everywhere. I spent more time prompt engineering instead of just writing the thing myself. And so this is another thing that comes up often is AI is touted as being this huge productivity saver, but first of all, time saver. But first of all, maybe that time is important to us. Maybe it's valuable as part of the creative process. And then also, maybe you're just trading one form of time for another, right? You've become more productive in generation, but now you are less productive in that you have to edit everything. Whereas, a lot of times, so that is coming from on high, right? That's coming from a supervisor that is forcing people to use AI. And yet people on their own are also really excited to use AI. So I'm a data visualization engineer and artist. And we did a survey 2 years ago about the challenges and opportunities for visualization in the age of generative models. And so through some crowdsourced surveys, we found some different things, ideas people had for how AI could be beneficial to their work, and then also some fears that they had about it. And so in classic visualization designer fashion, we created some visualizations of sort of what those opportunities and risks might look like. We realized that we were very much interested in the upper right corner of both. So on the opportunity side, what are we most excited about and what's most feasible? On the risk side, what's the most concerning and the most inevitable? I won't go into these too much, but if you want to read the paper, it's called Doom or Deliciousness. It's available online without a paywall. And yeah, we found some interesting sort of pull quotes and feedback from people about that. So this also brings me back to the idea of how much does a creative work have to be diluted and transformed to be different, right? You have a play, an adaptation of the play, a TV show that's depicting characters from the film that's an adaptation of the play, a painting that's depicting scenes from the TV show that's depicting characters from the film of the adaptation of the play, right? And this goes on and on and on. And so how do these kind of iterative steps of reproduction impact the way that we think about who's owed what when? And so my question is, can we crowdsource networks that involve AI that do feel okay to everyone? Are there compensation scenarios that a model builder is collecting these artist paintings, but with consent, and they're paying royalties to the artist, and the art lovers are still buying art prints from the artist, even though they're also maybe generating some digital art. So I anticipate that we'll have a lot of disagreements. Lots of people are on all ends of the spectrum, right? Some people are solidly in this corner, which is that I don't care about compensation or consent. No matter what, it's still problematic because of the environmental impacts. Whereas some folks don't care about any of those extra details. They just say it's derivation, just like how humans take inspiration from other people. So I'm really interested to see, which hypotheticals in the creative economy folks want to model. And yeah, I'd love to like talk to anyone that wants to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. We have a few minutes, or we can probably stay over. I don't think anyone has this room if you want to hang out a little bit longer after 1 even.
Yeah, sorry, I had a lot of slides.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. It was so interesting. We're recording this, so just to be aware, if you ask a question, you're welcome to say your name and introduce yourself before you ask the question, or if you don't want to say your name, that's totally fine too. So with that, are there any questions? And Jane, feel free to just field questions.
Cool.
I'll start off more with a comment, maybe, and get maybe you have some reaction to it.
Cool.
So I've been teaching engineering design here for about 35 years, and creativity is an issue there. And I try to get engineers, and it's more recently I've been talking about this, saying this is like your poetry. It's got to go through iterations, and the method that we use, it's called axiomatic design. But it relies on reductionism, so decomposing something, getting it down to smaller elements where the solutions are known. So maybe you see the what's in common there, and then you combine those into some new purpose. And so I thought a lot of this read remarkably well on what we're doing with engineering. We start off, too, trying to verbalize it, so saying it and explaining it in words. And this quote, I've forgotten who said it, but writing is nature's way of letting you know how sloppy your thinking is. And then
Nice.
Math is nature's way of letting you know how sloppy your writing is.
Oh, nice.
So, so we try to make those steps, too, in the engineering design problem. So, we're trying to describe it verbally with some rough drawings and then promoting it. And it's interesting when I ask AI to try this and decompose it, it knows enough to do that, but the stuff it comes up with is verbose, boring, just interpolations at best.
Yeah.
Optimize this. So anyway, a lot of this read on what I've been doing in engineering design for over 3 decades. So
Yeah,
thank you very
very
much,
cool.
Jane. That was great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it also reminds me of, I think it's the Michelangelo. There's a quote that said, he's like, I don't ever make a statue. The statue is already in the block of marble, right? I just remove the pieces that aren't the statue. It also reminds me of, I don't know if you've seen Project Autodesk, I forget what it was called. Autodesk Generative Design, maybe? So Autodesk came out with this software that you could give it your different design constraints, and it would create these models of how to build a bicycle, or and some of the things that it created were very interesting. But one of the problems that that folks encounter when they're using those kinds of tools is that you're creating essentially a digital twin of the real world. And so you have to really know your real world in order to explain to a machine how to exist in that world, right? And so it becomes this multivariate equation that engineers have been struggling with forever. Of you not only have to think about the tensile and the shear strength and all of that, but you also have to think about potholes and road salt when you're designing a bicycle. And so it becomes a challenge not it becomes a challenge of description, basically, of representation of your environment, of accurate simulation, which is an asymptotic thing to aspire to, right? Because you could add infinite variables, right? It's the whole idea of the butterfly effect and a single butterfly wings changing everything around. You can only put so much information into a system.
Hi.
Hey.
Great talk. I'm going to try to form this into a question. One of the artists you showed seemed to use the AI as an instruction, and then they created the art from there.
Oh, so that's Saul LeWitt. He's actually a very old artist. He predates AI. So he was actually just creating instructions that were draw 5 parallel lines, or draw 100 lines that intersect each other so many times. And what was cool about that work is that it will be installed in multiple different locations, and every place that it's installed is slightly different. So a lot of his instructions are intentionally vague about, if you're drawing on a wall, and you think about all of the different things that are on the wall, if his instructions say every time you meet an edge, you should bounce off of it, well, then all of a sudden, it depends on what's on the wall, where the bounces are coming from. So
Yeah, it reminds me of the Fluxus art movement from the 70s and 80s, where artists were switching from focusing on making a product and were focused on creating instructions as a process. It reminded me too of this paper. It took me forever to pull up. It's by Lubert. It's basically how can AI be creative partners, and he outlines, I think, 5 possible relationships. One is like the nanny, one is the coach, one is the colleague. Basically, my question is a possible ethical relationship one which decenters AI as creating the final product, and instead AI becomes part of the artist's process,
Right.
Inspired by the Fluxus art movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of how I think about AI. Is it's a tool, and tools can be used for great good or great evil. It's up to humans how we employ those. But the idea, also of a colleague is interesting. I recently did some work. This is not about AI art, but this is about a visualization tool that allowed for data exploration. And one of the things that we found we had to do in order to create an effective interface was actually limit what the AI could do, because we wanted to create parity between the user and the AI. So that's P-A-R-I-T-Y. So the idea that if a user isn't able to perform computation because it's an exploratory dashboard, you're just looking at a heat map, you shouldn't be able to find the standard deviation of the heat map. And so we limited the AI so that it couldn't do that either, because we really wanted it to be like a collaborative relationship. And that's where you hear everybody is now naming their system Copilot, right? You have Microsoft with their text generator Copilot. You also have GitHub with its code generator Copilot. But it's a useful analogy to think about, right? The Copilot in the plane, and
I like that. Thank you.
I already had my turn, but since nobody was speaking up. One other thing I wanted to comment on. I loved that you used the Mandelbrot set at the far left end.
Yeah.
And it was close to 35 years ago. I was working on that and using that as inspiration to describe irregular surfaces, which all surfaces are at some level, some sufficient magnification. And we were playing with the Mandelbrot set too. And we generated this, and I had some really good students who were making it mountainous and flying through it. And I was trying to convince the Worcester Art Museum that this was art and they should get on this and display this and this would be living. And we had an interesting discussion with Donna Harkavy, who was the curator then, and Mark Lynch, who was head of education at that time. And she's saying, well, it's not art because the hand has to be involved.
Oh.
And we go, oh, really? So then handicapped people can't do art? Because one of my arguments was I can manipulate the Mandelbrot set with a joystick or eye movement.
Yeah.
You could be very physically limited and create art this way. So she had to sort of back off from that. and then but she didn't really have a good argument. Finally, the students were computer science students, right? And finally she says, well, we did have some computer art. And she showed us, this is what we exhibited. And they go, that's not art, that's an integrated circuit. That's an ECE, 2503. We know what that is. That's not art. It was really an interesting conversation, but the Worcester, I thought this would be a great collaboration for us. It was very nice to see that here. Mandelbrot actually spoke here.
Really? Wow,
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also thought about putting Aristide Lindenmeyer's L systems on here. So he did a lot of computational modeling of branching systems that have a certain amount of of entropy in them.
Who is that?
Aristid Lindenmayer. Here, I'll pull up. They're also known as L systems. So a lot of video game designers use L systems really extensively now because they're ways of getting a bunch of trees that all look really different. And it's from a very simple set of rules, right? Where you have, these are very simple trees that are generated with L systems. But it's basically, you start with, you start with A, and anytime that you have A, you change the A to an AB, and anytime that you have B, you change the B to an A. So that's how you get like a very simple branching structure, right? And these can also be used for modeling like growth systems and things like that. But then in order to create this, sort of more realistic environment, you just add a little bit of wiggle to each branch. And that's how you get these, with a very small amount of computation, you get these really beautiful trees that kind of mimic what we see in real life.
Yeah, that's very close to Mandelbrot's fractal geometry of nature.
Yeah.
He said you could describe all the trees in North America with 17 parameters. I said, yeah, we're not quite through yet. We're trying. That's pretty neat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. This has been so much fun and really appreciate the talk. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.